Hey there, and welcome to Brave Business Triumphs in partnership with Next, a growth acceleration agency. In our customer and control world, it's critical to understand that your business and your brand need to be more connected than ever before. Check out each episode with host Doug Longenecker and his special guests as they check in with growth-minded leaders and their organizations, exploring why and how they strive to make their businesses more personal and their brands more human. Learn from their inspiring stories of uphill battles, perseverance, and what it takes to make the necessary bold moves with confidence. Get ready, because here we go.
Hey there, I'm your host, Doug Longenecker. Thank you for joining us today. On this episode, we are speaking with Ed Farris, a strategic marketing and brand consultant to CMOs and senior leadership teams in various B2B and manufacturing industries. His career spans companies and brands such as British Petroleum, GE, and ExxonMobil, where he has led global branding and integrated marketing programs, including communications, packaging, and public relations. Most recently, he has been partnering with executive leadership to guide the transformation of sales teams from transactional-based selling to value-based selling, as well as leading initiatives to connect the organization's customer vision throughout the entire company. Ed, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today and to speak with you about the implications of our customer control world, specifically in relation to business and brands. Now, full transparency, Ed Farris and I have worked together at a strategic marketing and brand consultancy and have had many good experiences and adventures together. So Ed, welcome to Brave Business Triumphs.
Well, hey, Doug, thanks so much. It's always great to speak to you, particularly about something that I know we're both really passionate about.
Yes. How to move business forward.
Exactly.
Well, anyway, again, thanks for being here and looking forward to getting your understanding and your perspective on a customer control world. So with that in mind, customer control world is a different phrase and it has many implications, but how would you best describe that to industry peers or clients?
That's a good question, Doug. You know, I've always believed it's about looking at your business through the eyes of your customers. And for me, this is something that I was practicing going back at least 10, 15 years in the past. And, you know, before the term customer control, I always use the term a market back look at your business. But when I look at the customer control, it really is the same thing. It really is looking at the eyes through, looking at your business, I should say, through the eyes of your customers. 10 years ago, I worked for a company called Momentive. That had been a GE business for about 70 years until it was sold to a private equity back in around 2008. And there at that time, what we did was we started running internal workshops with global cross-functional teams. So that was sales, marketing, R&D, et cetera, and on how to bring new products to markets. And this was in a category of specialty chemicals, so that we could develop business plans, marketing propositions that would resonate with the real and underlying needs of customers. You know, that really is like, how do you come up with, how do you identify their tangible and emotional needs? That was really the first time it had been done in that company. And again, the focus was on looking at the business through the eyes of our customers, not through the eyes of us. And so at first, we really had to educate our own people as to why we were doing this before we could get started, number one. That, like in most companies, there's a lot of tribal knowledge about products, about customers. You know, we made assumptions that we knew everything about customers and that kind of stuff. And the sales force there was very technical. Excuse me, that had come out of a GE heritage. And, you know, in a heritage like that, all they had to do was show people their business card with that GE logo on it, and they could get attention from targets customers. So this was a relatively new approach and, you know, quite refreshing. Took a little bit of time to get people to understand it, but going back 10 years was really the first time when we really started to focus on market backer, customer control focus, and how to and how to build business plans around that.
Well, I'm curious, what was one of the not the bigger challenges, but what was one of the bigger mechanisms or more effective mechanisms to help change that mindset from a sales force who was really adept at being able to show that card with GE on it and that recognition, and then move to a brand that didn't quite have that recognition, where they might have to, in quotes, work harder to get entry to a sales contact?
That's always a challenge. When you have a marquee name on your card, it's always easy to get an audience. And, this was almost like a night and day proposition going from a brand that was incredibly well known, GE that is, and then to a rebranded company called Momentive Performance Materials that was nobody had ever heard of because it was, the name was new and the name had just been introduced and not a lot of money was being spent behind it. So it's that in itself is a challenge, number one. And then when you have to kind of retrain a sales, marketing, and really just a business culture on looking at business differently and looking at it through the eyes of your customers,
Mm-hmm.
that can be a pretty seismic change, particularly for folks, in that company they had a lot of senior people who had been there a long time, and so it's almost like relearning what you do every day. And it sounds easy. Yeah, let's just learn a new approach and we'll go out and do it. It's not always that easy, and folks are usually more comfortable with the status quo. And change is sometimes really hard to embrace and build some real rhythm around being able to follow that.
Yes, and now in other parts of your career, you worked with sales teams to work through that transition of being transactional based to value based, and within that, it's more a consultative approach, and inherent to that is adding value in different ways. So if we look at the new value equation now between companies, organizations, brands, and their customers or consumers. A lot of that value exchange is around giving up personal data to hopefully have a more personal experience. And in doing so, customers do gain a little bit more control. The other side of that equation is companies gain a lot more information and better ways to effectively communicate and work with customers. But also to do that more effectively, they need to relinquish some control. And that's not always easy to do. What do you see as some of the benefits to that value exchange?
That's again, that's interesting. I mean, I think in terms of some of the larger consumer companies, or maybe even global B2B enterprises, I think they're probably more in tune to that. I mean, look at what folks like Amazon and Facebook and Google do. I mean, how many retargeting ads are you fed, for instance, once you start doing some online searching or shopping or stuff like that? So I think folks at that companies, I should say, at that level are pretty well attuned to that. Most of my focus over the last many years has been really more on the small and mid-sized B2B companies or even startups. And I think in that area, I'm not sure that they're as in tuned. I think that this is an area that is still a bit underdeveloped or not developed at all. And so maybe it's a real opportunity going forward, because I think there are advantages, as you mentioned. I mean, clearly for business, it's an opportunity. The data is an opportunity to guide how they develop customer strategies. They can create maybe a more personalized customer experience, even ensure a better return on their marketing investment dollars, let's say. So, those are really good benefits. On the customer side, yeah, it's going to enable a more customized experience. They can kind of figure out how they want to engage with a brand and get that experience. But I think there's a lot of goodness here, but I think also, as I said, in regards to small, mid-size, or even startup, I'm just not sure that they're there yet. So I think this is an area where over the next several years, that may be a growing trend. It may be an area where some companies of that size may need some assistance.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's opportunities there, and maybe it's an unmet need for a lot of those companies. Just if you look at the category segments you're talking about, sometimes in those level of organizations, maybe they've not been collecting data at the volumes of bigger companies, or they may not have the IT systems in place to, if they are collecting data, to be able to extract that and be able to utilize it properly in terms of applying it to the vision of the business and business goals.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, data, we've always said for years, data is great, but the ability to take data and turn it into usable knowledge that really helps drive a business is always the goal. And you're right, in some of these smaller organizations, they just don't have the bandwidth, let's say, or to be able to do that. So collecting the data is one thing, but obviously, unless you can translate it into something tangible, then it's all data.
Yeah, totally agree. Hey, just in shifting gears a bit, if we look at the B2B business environment, what do you see as one of the biggest challenges that businesses and brands face when it comes to accelerating or sustaining growth? And those sometimes are two different things, not that they're competing, but accelerating versus sustaining. And maybe you can address that a little bit.
I could sum that up in probably one word, but I'll give you a little bit more than one word, but the one word would really be discipline. And by that, what I mean is maintaining that focus on how to build, and you really have to build a foundation for sustainable growth. And that takes discipline. It's easy for a business to get distracted by day-to-day business demands. I mean, you have a big customer that has an issue, a competitor is making noise, a market change, a trend, some new news. There's always something that's happening that's going to take you away from, let's say, a longer term plan. I preached this for years. It sounds like a cliche, but man, do I think it's true. It's sustainable growth does not happen overnight. It really truly requires buy-in from all levels of an organization. So from marketing to sales to R&D to manufacturing, supply chain, finance, HR. I'm probably missing a few functions here, but you kind of get the idea. And
Yeah.
across that, every functional leader really needs to understand what key measures that might be needed in his or her area so that they're aligned with the sustainable growth vision. It's not just sales and marketing doing this stuff. You need to make sure you have the resources, the dollars, the investment. That's where finance and HR and all those other functions come into play. And even in doing that, when you identify measures, it can't be 10 things that you need to do in 3 months. It's just not going to happen. It needs to be a
Hmm.
realistic plan, sometimes taken in snackable bits or steps, incremental steps to get to where you want to get to. And then what I found also is that you really need somebody, sustainable growth, everybody wants that, right? But then, and you can lay out a foundation, but you really then need somebody who's in charge of integrating all of this and that so that those day-to-day distractions don't really stop you, and somebody who's really keeping it all together, making sure it all works. And because without that, the distractions will kill you, you'll lose your discipline, and you really have less of a chance than ever really achieving that desired goal of sustainable growth.
Well, I got to tell you, that was a really good answer, and you covered a lot of ground and a lot of space in answering that question. So I'm going to try and unpack a little bit of that because I think you mentioned a number of different things, and feel free to respond. But in mentioning discipline is one of the strongest aspects to make it work. It seems like the discipline you're talking about is discipline in having an integrated approach, and that dynamic really comes to the forefront when we talk about a customer control world, or even what it takes to develop and implement a customer control strategy for today's customer. It needs to be pervasive throughout the entire organization. That's how you really have the big win.
It's like anything else all oars have to be rowing in the same direction, because without that, a lot of organizations just think it's a sales and marketing thing or it's a sales thing. And
Hmm.
it can't be any further from that. And, and part of the challenge I've had in some of the companies I've worked with where our initiative was to go in and put together a plan to drive growth, X amount of growth over over a time period, a year to 3 years, let's say. It really is, how do you go back and look at all those levels of the organization, identify where they are today, what do they need to put into play in order to drive growth? What's the gap that they have between where they are versus where they want to be? And then what are the countermeasures that they need to put in place in order to close that gap? And that's where that's where it's integrated. That's where you need somebody to oversee the whole thing and make sure that all folks are in line, because you may get sales and marketing up in front, but finance isn't involved, or HR, and you can't get the right people. So you're right. It's got to be across all parts of the organization, and they all have to buy into it as well, Doug, because it's a mindset, and the culture really needs to be focused on this, and it's team sport. It's not individual sport, and so without that team sport, often you find that organizations struggle.
Well, you're absolutely right. I agree wholeheartedly with that in terms of having buy-in and alignment with not even just executive or senior leadership teams, but throughout the entire organization. And I think there's many times where you've experienced where there is a vision, whether it's just short-term or short-term and long-term, and you've got a number of the executives and senior leadership teams who agree with what that vision is, but then sometimes what's really important to the allocation of resources is pace and scale of that vision. And they might believe in the vision, but they don't have the same alignment on those two categories. And that can sometimes really create some friction when you get to the end of your time period and you realize as the president or CEO or owner of a company that you're not where you thought you would be, even though you had buy-in to your vision.
Well, that's, again, priorities change. It's what I mentioned earlier. It's the day-to-day stuff that gets in the way. And that's why I go back to that single word about discipline, because if we all agree that this is our vision, these are the steps that we need in order to get there. How do we maintain the course without allowing those day-to-day distractions, again, that I mentioned earlier, to get in the way? And that is a challenge, because how many times in a day have we set out to do one thing in that single day, achieve one thing, and then you get to work, and four other things pop up, and before you realize it, at the end of the day, you accomplished everything except that one single thing that you set out to do on that particular day. Same thing happens with a plan around sustainable growth, and that's why that discipline to be able to juggle the day-to-day with the longer term is always a challenge, and where I find where most organizations stumble.
Yes, and then to be able to, like you said earlier, to have that integrator position or role, who maybe their primary focus is to make sure that the day-to-day doesn't consume everybody and take us off track of the vision.
Yeah, it's like the coach in in sports, or the manager in baseball, or something like that. Somebody's got to oversee it and knit the whole thing together.
Mm-hmm. Hey, jumping around our questions a little bit, in some respects, the B2C world is, this is going to sound horrible, but moves in advance of B2B, or B2B trends, or trends in marketing and advertising and sales sometimes follow that of the consumer world. Sometimes, not always. And one of the bigger hot buttons now is cause-related marketing in the consumer world. How do you see that playing out in the B2B environment? And not like it's not like it's been absent, because there's numbers of corporations who have corporate social responsibilities and see that as important issues to take on and tackle, but they might not be at the forefront or the visibility as some of the consumer ones.
Cause-centric marketing is kind of interesting. I mean, you're right. I think you see a lot more of it with consumer brands. I think that it's much easier to build a personal relationship with a consumer brand. I think when you get to B2B, it's, what I've always felt is you need to be open. Businesses need to be open, I should say. You need to be real, and even generous. And by generous, I mean, a business that's generous with its knowledge, and that can be interesting if they share their thought leadership and share what they know that's meaningful today. I mean, it's always important to have, if a business has a point of view on something, and that's related to cause-centric marketing, then by all means, I think it's something that can be used. If you do, then it's not, in my mind, a marketing gimmick. It's really who you are. I mean, what a brand stands for is almost more important than what you sell or what you do. And I don't think today, I think customers or consumers are savvy enough that they don't want to be sold anymore. They want to obviously relate to a brand that thinks and does the same things that they do. So I think with cost-centric marketing, if you do it right, it does allow you to differentiate yourself from competitors, especially those that are traditional in their approach, or maybe seem more comfortable with the status quo, or not getting into the cost-centric marketing so much. So I think there's, again, opportunities here.
Yeah, and I agree with your point. It is a fine line between, you know, being an initiative and cause that is a shared value between your organization and your customer versus being just a marketing gimmick.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, gimmicks just don't work anymore. So it's got to be real.
Hmm. Hey, you've had a really good career and worked on some big, well-known, powerful brands. In looking back, what is some of your best or favorite experiences that you've had the privilege to work on?
Well, yeah, I have worked on some. I've worked on both the consumer side. I've worked on the B2B side. And the consumer side, I worked for a couple of the large oil companies and worked on that everybody would know. Um, the experience that I talked about a little bit earlier about when I worked at Momentive, that used to be a GE company. That was pretty interesting because there you were going from an incredibly well-known brand to almost overnight a brand that nobody had ever heard of. So
Yeah,
that
talk about a
was,
challenge.
yeah. I mean, it's clearly it's easier when it's a household name that everybody knows, and even there's some sort of connection. But the one at Momentum was really quite interesting, and we talked about a little bit earlier these market back workshops that we ran there. That was really part of an overarching goal of how to create a long-term vision for sustainable growth. I mean, that was a company that their sales had been kind of flat for years when they were sold to a private equity company. Obviously, there was a desire to grow the business and eventually sell it. That's the nature of private
Hmm.
equity. So I was part of the team that came in as to how do we really develop a long-term sustainable growth plan over a couple of year horizon. Um, I think what really made that interesting there, though, was the challenge for that business in itself. It was so it was really, they were almost their own worst enemy. That was about a $3 billion global business. They operate in the Americas and Europe and Asia, just about everywhere across the world. But it was a business that all the regions had been used to doing things on their own. They all ran their own P&L. They were not all knitted together. It wasn't a team thing. And
Yeah,
at the end, it was really difficult to get that organization to mesh and to form consensus around around a common goal. So there, the culture wasn't right, and it was more about everybody doing their own thing and acting independently. And it was really a challenge to gain consensus. You asked what was my best experience. It was best because I learned. It was challenging, but it was also maybe one of the best because I really got to see both sides of it. I saw a really good plan that was trying to be put in place, and I saw the pushback and internal fighting, people that didn't want to be involved in it. And there we came up with a saying, which was, you can't really turn off the lights on a Friday, turn them on Monday, and everybody's on the same page. It really takes a lot of work, and sometimes in some organizations that there's a lot of resistance. It's kind of like turning that big ocean liner around in the middle of the ocean. You can't really do that easily,
right.
And so there was a challenge there.
Was
You
there
know, and
was
at
there any
the
defining moment that you can think of that really allowed the organizations to start making that turn?
Well, what's interesting is I don't think they ever got there, Doug, and I think this, if we were saying was this a victory or a defeat, I think it it probably was, it wasn't a total defeat, but by the same token, there were some good measures put into play here that helped the business, but it clearly could have been much more successful. In the end, I think what we found in that business was we called it the status quo mafia. The folks that didn't want to change, they really wanted to maintain the way business, they wanted to maintain business as usual, even though that business had been sold and the usual was no longer there. So I think what I learned out of that as the best experience was it really taught me the importance of culture, and where organizations can be their own worst enemy. And earlier we talked about that discipline and that integrator and getting consensus.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's where I truly learned how important and how valuable that really was. Because at the end of the day, the long-term plan for growth that we were trying to put in there was really a good one. It was sound. And I have continued to practice the framework of that, 10, 15 years later. So it was a good plan put into place in a company that needed it, but the company, the organization just didn't want it. So it was because the best experience, because like I said, I got to see all different sides of it, and I really learned there what was so valuable and why it failed, why it could fail, and then how I could help future organizations work around that so that they didn't run into that same problem.
Well, that is a good experience, and it's you mentioned status quo and business as usual, and how hard that is to change. What's interesting now is the dynamics in play with business because of technology and lots of other cultural and technological issues and advancements. That kind of mindset is really, it's a losing proposition at this point.
I agree. I mean, status quo, you can, when you look at legacy brands that have been bypassed, almost overnight, right?
Mm-hmm.
You realize that, change is, you need to be, change for the sake of change is maybe not the way to think about it, but you really need to, it's evolving and it's iterative. And status quo, can haunt you at the end. And again, when you look at brands that 10, 15 years ago, or even longer, legacy brands, as I mentioned earlier, that have been just byplaced and put out of the market. You're right. The technology today makes it happen even faster. So you need to be nimble. You need to be forward thinking, and status quo needs to really be evaluated and assessed in planning how you go forward.
Well, that's a works out to be a pretty good segue into the next question. Looking at where business and office dynamics are today in regards to leadership, what is one of what is the key attribute that is needed, but oftentimes overlooked in today's environment as you're working with leadership teams today?
Well, I guess I'm going to recycle an answer here. I'm going to go back to that same single word that I gave you earlier, which was discipline. I think discipline is incredibly important, because I think it is so easy to drift and to lose focus. It's kind of like when you if you set a vision for growth, business, whatever. It's kind of like you're getting in your car. Where you have a trip to make, you know where you want to get to. So you get in your car, you turn the key, you start the engine, you know where you want to go, but you start driving and all of a sudden you hit construction, or there's traffic, or there's a detour, there's a roadblock, there's whatever. And before you know it, you're distracted from reaching your destination. You may get there eventually, or you may have to turn around and go back. But that discipline to not let those things get in your way and keep going forward is the challenge. And you really need that discipline to stay on course and keep forward, even in the face of distraction. So I think discipline is one. I'll give you another one as well.
Okay.
And
Bonus.
it's listening. You know, people often, I'm always amazed that people talk about communication skills, but by communication skills, we always talk about the ability to speak, but nobody ever really talks about listening, which to me is one of the most important, maybe the most important communication skills, because when you listen, it's amazing what you'll hear from your consumers, from the market, from even the people in your own organization.
Mm-hmm.
And often you find nuggets of information or answers in there that could be knitted together and help you really identify opportunities for a business. But I think listening is another important thing. And particularly, you know, we go back to the customer and control. Listen to your customers. Don't let them drive your business. That's not what I'm suggesting here. But listen and understand. And again, it's all part of looking at the market through their eyes. That's why listening to them is so important. So discipline and listening are two good attributes that I would put into play there.
Well, I got to tell you, those are two great attributes to leadership. And I'm so glad you came back with the second one about listening. Not only because it's important, but because we've worked together and I know you a bit, I really predicted that was going to be your answer, was going to be listening. And when you mentioned discipline first, I was like, wow, maybe I don't know Ed as well as I thought I did.
Well, so you see, you have been listening to me for all these years, so that's good.
Yes. And then congratulations, because you've now made it to the lightning round.
Oh, that's great. Okay, any prizes associated with this, Doug?
Um, there is, but I guess we'll have to talk about that afterwards.
Well, let me just, my gift is being able to speak to you today, so that's enough for me.
Well, that's you're too kind. So let's get to the lightning round. What is the last book you read?
Last book I read. I just finished a book. It's called JFK's, John F. Kennedy's Last 100 Days. It chronicles the last 100 days of his life before he was assassinated in 1963. It's written by a fellow named Thurston Clark. Really interesting. A lot of inside information that if he was in office today, the news media would probably have a field day with him. It's a lot of inside stories that I was not familiar with. Kind of interesting, paints a much different picture of him than you may have thought.
Oh, and could you put together a whole new conspiracy theory?
No, that's another podcast.
It's another whole other book.
Right.
Who was the last person you texted?
Probably one of my daughters. Actually, she just texted me while we were having this dialogue. So usually they text me when they're in trouble. So I'm sure I'll have to deal with that shortly.
All right. Well, that's something I think we're all familiar with as parents. Any tattoos?
No. My body, nobody wants to disturb it with any tattoos.
What's your favorite app?
Favorite app? No, anything that helps me get around traffic. You know, it's traffic is miserable in this area here, so anything that helps me navigate or take a shortcut or something like that, I'm all for that.
All right, good. Steve Jobs or Bill Gates?
Yeah, they're both interesting guys. I mean, you know, when you think about technology and how technology has changed everyday life, both of those guys are at the forefront of, you know, I'm thinking about if you go back in time 20, 25 years to before any of their technology was put in place till today, our world is very different because of those two guys.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes they're not as different as we think.
No, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to flip a coin on this one. I don't know. I'm going to pass on that one.
Okay, that's a workable answer as well. What's the last foreign country you visited?
I was in the Netherlands about a year or so ago. I was actually there on business. I wish it had been vacation, but it wasn't. I was running a 2-day workshop for one of my clients. It was a global colorant supplier, and the workshop was how they could relaunch a product that had done very poorly in the market, how they could relaunch it. And quite honestly, a lot of what we've talked about today with the market back approach and really understanding your customers and their persona and focused on needs and how do you generate some value added and things like that. That's really what I was doing for them in the Netherlands. So that was the last country I visited.
That's not a bad place to be.
No, not at all.
What's the best place near you for a business lunch?
Come on, Doug. We live in New Jersey. It's any diner.
Taylor ham or pork roll?
Either one. Can't go wrong with either one.
How many frequent flyer miles?
I used to have so many. I don't know. I've kind of lost track of them. They don't seem to be as relevant anymore. So I have no idea.
How long did you prep for this interview?
I don't know. I mean, time was, this is an area that you and I are both pretty passionate about this stuff. And so it's, time is really irrelevant. It's good subjects. There's a lot of goodness in what we have discussed today. A lot of good information to share with people. We're just scratching the surface, obviously, here in the dialogue. But, when you prep for something that you enjoy talking about, time becomes irrelevant.
Oh, that's good. But you're right. There's deeper dives on a lot of the different subjects and topics that we touched on today. Hey, last question. Did you enjoy your time on Brave Business Triumphs podcast today?
Yeah, Doug, you and I have known each other for a while. We've worked together in the past. I think that this is a really good program that you put together here. I think that there's some good knowledge to be able to share with people. And there's some interesting discussions here. This whole thing about customer and control and how it really drives business today and brands today is a real good area for dialogue. I read a lot of stuff about it. And I think that some of the work that you're doing really goes along to reinforce what I've read in other areas. So, yeah, good
thanks.
work.
I'm really excited about the concept and notion of customer control and the implications that has on an entire organization's, its business and its brand, and most importantly, its customers. So, Ed,
couldn't agree with you more.
Ed, I've really enjoyed having you on Brave Business Triumphs today. I don't want to take too much of your time, but again, just it was great to reconnect and glad we had a chance to review a lot of what's going on in a customer control world as it relates to business and to brand.
Hey, Doug, my pleasure. Happy to come back anytime and talk further with you about this.
I look forward to it.
Take care.
All right, you too. See you.